Before we begin, I want to note that I'm using the Studio Production Style interface, which gives us the ability to have a Dynamics tab, and along with all of our other tabs being grouped up a little bit better than the default interface. And we can access this by going to Edit, and then Edit Menu Layout, and if we see under Presets, we have the Studio Production Style. And we go ahead and click Done after that is loaded, and it's just a much easier way of working with Lightwave, and something I definitely prefer over the default or some of the older versions and the way everything's set up. And if we take a look in the Dynamics tab, we can see there's an Effects Tools set of buttons, and we also have a Dynamic Object set. And there's different ways we can add our particles to our scene, and along with our other objects as well. One thing we have is in the Effects browser. I'm going to move that up to the top of the screen, and we can see that we can add in a number of the different effects that are available, along with applying different effects to individual objects, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. But we can add in our HV emitters, Partigon emitters, wind, collision, gravity, also load items in. So we can work directly within this interface in order to customize new groups as well. And sometimes it could be easier to use this depending on the complexity of your scene. I'm going to go ahead and close this out right now, and we're going to start out by using just the dynamic options set and going through some of the individual buttons and taking a look at each option and of course the differences and how we can use them together. The first option that we have is going to be collision, and we're going to move on to that once we have some particles in our scene. We also have the wind, the gravity, and then the particle, also adding effectors into our scene, and then partigons. So first let's select particle, and now it's going to ask us what we'd like the emitter to be called, and I'm just going to call this emitter_1 just to start out with, because we're not going to have too much in our scene at this point, and we're not going to have to worry about really making any separations between the different objects. And now we can see we can also select our emitter type. If I click on this and hold, we can see we have an HV emitter and a Partigon emitter. And these really depend on how you'd like to display the particles in your scene. First I'm going to select the Partigon emitter and click OK. And now we have these partigons showing up, which are basically one-point polygons. With the HV emitter, they will not show up in the scene for our renders. And I just want to show you how these are going to render differently before I actually get into how to manipulate each of these objects. So first what I want to do is just go to our Motion tab, and I'm going to add in Explosion and set that to 3. And that's just going to give a little bit of that explosion on our particles, which is going to make them expand outward as we drag through our scene. So now we have these particles showing up. I'm going to switch to our camera view, open up our camera properties, which we can do by selecting camera on the bottom or hitting Shift C and then P on the keyboard, which is going to open up our property panel for our camera. I'm going to change this to an HD 720p and also add a little bit of anti-aliasing, where I'll just set it to PLD 4-pass, which is going to just go over the scene 4 times with that anti-aliasing. I'm going to keep adaptive sampling off, because really this is going to render very quickly anyway, and we don't need to worry about any of the other settings. So now if I go to our render tab that we have, we can select render frame. This is also F9 that we can use, but currently F9 for me is set for recording the tutorial, so I'm going to be using the button for this to render. You can select render frame, and now we can see that we just have all of these little partigons and one-point polygons being rendered in our scene. And we can also adjust the way these render. If we open up the object properties, which we can do by hitting Shift O or going down to the bottom, selecting objects, and then selecting emitter 1, and then hit P on the keyboard or go to properties, we can open up the object properties specifically for these particles. We can see under geometry, it says effects emitter for our object type, and it also lists how many particles we have in the scene. So as I drag through and go into an earlier part of the animation, it still says 183, but if I close this out, open it back up, it's going to show the same because we have 183 total being created throughout our entire scene. If I change this overall frame to 120 frames, so now we're working with about 4 seconds of animation, go to our Dynamics tab, which is where we're going to have the ability to adjust our different dynamics. Go to our particles, and I'm going to change the lifetime to 120. And I'll be going through each of those settings a little bit later. But now as I drag through, we can see that updating with the amount of particles that are going to show up. And now we have 363. So let's take a look at some of our rendering options. Because these are particles, we can use the shadow methods on them, and there's also ways to define how large these particles are going to be. Right now, if we take a look, we can see the particle line thickness is currently set to 1 pixel. And I'm going to go ahead and render out another frame really quick so we can see later in the animation with more of these particles. We just have these small little specks showing up, and they are 1 pixel. We can change this. We have the small, which is 1 pixel, medium, which is 2 pixels. Go ahead and render that frame out. And now we can see we have much larger particles. Can also change this to large, which is going to be 3 pixels. And we have even larger ones. And those are just our presets. We can also type in a manual value. I'm going to type in 5, so we have 5 pixels for our size. Render the frame. And now we notice that we have 5 pixel particles, much larger. We can also go down below 1 pixel, and I'm going to bring this down to 0.5. Render our frame, and now we're going to notice, if you can see this or not, whether or not the encoding on the tutorial is making them disappear, but we have very, very light particles. Basically they are 1 pixel, but they're dissolved much more, and they're showing up very small because of that dissolve, and it's just sort of the illusion that they are that sub-pixel size. I'm going to change that back to 1 pixels. And actually, just for this, so we can see them showing up a little better, I will change this up to 2 pixels. We can render our frame and take a look, just because it will be easier to see these particles. And let's take a look at some of our other options. If we open up the surface editor, we can see we now have a Partigon's surface under our emitter. And the nice thing about the way this is going to be set up is if we have multiple Partigons in the scene on different emitters, each emitter is going to be separate within the surface editor, so we can apply different surfaces to each particle emitter. What I'm going to do is just change our color, because right now we have it set to that gray default surface. I'm going to change this to more of an orangish yellow. We can go ahead and render our frame, and now we can see our particles have changed to that yellowish orange color. We can also use a lot of the other effects available. Mainly our glow intensity is one way to modify these particles and make them look a little more interesting. I'm going to change our glow intensity up to 100. And I'm not going to worry about any of our other settings. And if I render this out, we're not going to see the glow show up just yet, because we do need to apply this as a post-process filter. And the way we can do that is if we hold down Control and hit F8, it'll bring up our processing and our effects panel. And then what we can do is turn on Enable Glow. Now we can set our global intensity and also our glow radius. If you're working with several particle objects, a lot of the time you're going to want to be adjusting your glow intensity within each individual surface, and then have a global intensity in order to adjust the overall amount between the two. So if we have separate surfaces and we want one to glow more than the other, that's something you're going to want to set within your surface for the glow intensity, and not necessarily within the post-process. So let's take a look with our default settings with 50% intensity and a glow radius of 8 pixels. And now we can see just a little bit of glow showing up. Of course, a 50% global amount is not going to show up with an extremely intense value. Also, the glow radius will be affecting that as well. So let's go ahead and increase our intensity to 100% for our global intensity, and we can render out another frame. We can now see they're glowing much brighter, and it looks a little more interesting. Of course, our overall radius might still be a little low, so what I can do is type in a manual value and type in 16 pixels, which is going to double the amount that we have. And now we can see a much larger radius on each of our particles, and it just has that very nice glow to it. I'm going to go ahead and increase that value of our intensity up to 250, and that way we can see it even brighter, and all of those different particles are showing up very brightly. We've got a pretty neat looking effect. And one thing to keep in mind is, since our glow radius is based on a pixel amount, this amount will change as we switch to different size renders. So right now I'm rendering basically at 720p, and what I want to do is first render out a frame, and we're going to save this or just keep it loaded up. I'm going to minimize, and I'm going to switch this up to our 1080p resolution and render another frame. And also keep in mind that since this is a post-process effect, it will render our particles first and then apply the glow. So now we can see and switch between our two different renders. Of course, we're zoomed in very close to this 1080p, so I'm going to reduce this amount to 50% and just scale down our view. And now we can switch between the two, and of course our size is going to change, but if we take a look at the glow size, they're exactly the same on both because it's based on pixel amount and is not directly related to our overall size of our frame. So if we were to render in a higher resolution, we would need to increase that glow pixel size in order to get it to match up to something smaller. So you want to be doing your test frames at the full resolution that you're going to be working with in order to get them to look correct. I'm going to increase our glow radius a little bit higher. I'm going to go up to 25 pixels, and I'm also going to increase our intensity to 350. Give us a much more dramatic effect. We can go ahead and render out this frame, and then we can take a look and see how this is applying. We notice something much brighter, and the overall glow size is something much more noticeable. There are also other effects that are directly related to particles. First, I'm going to turn off our glow effect, and we're going to take a look back in the camera properties, and we can see we have motion blur. Now we can also turn on our particle blur, which is going to be separate from our motion blur. And right now we have a blur length of 50%, and our shutter efficiency is set to 100%. Motion blur passes is set to 1, and then grayed out because of the way we're working with our motion blur, and that's more directly related to the blur itself and not particle blur. So I'm going to render out another frame, and we can start to see a little bit of stretching on our particles, but it's not a very dramatic effect because how quickly our particles are moving in the scene. So let's increase that blur length up to 250% and render out another frame. We can now see a nice stretching on our particles, and we create a really neat particle blur effect separate from our motion blur. And also, if we take a look in the OpenGL, we can see little black lines showing up on our particles to show us and give us an idea of how far that blur length is going to be without actually rendering. So the more I increase this blur length, let's go ahead and bring it up to 500. And I'll just refresh our OpenGL. We can see that blur length is much longer and we have much more stretching. Go ahead and render that frame out, and now we can see those lines a little better. Now the reason the lines are not showing up on all of our particles is because we have a bit of particle resistance, which is going to slow down our particles once they reach a certain amount. And we're going to go ahead and change this just for rendering purposes right now. We're going to open up the object properties, select Dynamics, And now under particle, we have our resistance set to 1. I'm going to change this to 0, and now we can see our particles are moving out farther, and they're not slowing down throughout the animation. So we can render out another frame and see that a little bit better. Of course, some of our particles are still going to appear with shorter blur, but that's because of their positioning within the frame. Those are going to be angled a little bit closer to the camera and then directly to that center point. So of course they are going to appear as if they are not stretching as far. And if we switch to our perspective view and zoom in, we can see as we move around that all of our particles have that blur length. But of course, if we're looking directly at a particle, we're not going to see that blur length showing up. So let's go back into our camera properties and just increase that effect a little bit more. Give a blur length of 650, and we can refresh the OpenGL, and also go back into our post-processing, Control F8, and enable our glow once again. I'm going to reduce our radius this time though, and bring it down to 15 pixels, and we can render out the frame and see this a little bit better. We are noticing there are a few artifacts showing up within the scene, and that could be caused by the overall glow amount, and that's just a little bit of a render error I'm running into. I'm going to decrease our intensity to 150 and re-render out that frame. And we can see that error we were running into was mainly because of the overall glow intensity, and now it is completely gone, where those green dots have disappeared, so we don't need to worry about that. But we can get a really neat looking effect by using the motion blur along with the glow effect on our different surfaces. And we can also set a new surface for these particles, going into our surface editor, and we can make other changes as well. I can increase our luminosity, which will make them glow a little bit more, a little bit brighter in our color, and we can see the effects of that. I could also set up textures on this. I could remove our diffusion, increase our diffusion, and most of the settings we can use to create any sort of texture are going to apply to these particles. Of course, since they are such a small amount, it may not necessarily show up entirely, but one thing we can do is I'm going to set a different color, use the texture editor, going and clicking the T next to color. I'm going to set this layer type to a procedural texture, and we're just going to stick with the turbulence default, and I'm going to change this to a darker red just to give a little bit of color variation, increase our contrast and also our small power a little bit, and we can increase our frequency and make that a little more interesting. And this is of course going to travel through all of our particles. So let's render another frame. And now we can see that color variation showing up throughout our particles and also within our particle blur. And if we wanted to make this a little more dramatic, we could go back into our color, set that to black, and now we have that showing up. Increase our contrast to make really dark areas, and then go ahead and render out another frame of that. And we can see that some of our areas of particles are now disappearing, and because it's black, it's not going to affect our glow. And it's just a way to break up these different particles, and we can do a lot of different effects with that, changing color, and also over time by using envelopes and different keyframe effects for our particles. So there's a lot we can do with it. And now let's take a look at the HV particles. And what I'm going to do is just go back to frame 0, and with our emitter 1 selected, hit the minus key on the keyboard to clear our object from the scene. I'm going to switch back to our perspective view. We're going to go to the Dynamics tab and add in a new particle object. I'm going to call this emitter_HV, And now we're going to select the HV emitter type and click OK. Go to our motion option, explosion of 3, particle time and the lifetime set to 120, and also set its resistance to 0. And that way we have the exact same settings that we have before. We can go to our camera view and we can take a look at our object. And now if I render our frame, we're going to see that these particles are not going to render. And that's the difference between our particle and particons and our HV. And that is, HV particles are not going to show up within our renders, and they're mainly there for using hypervoxels. We can also use the particles that we had with hypervoxels, because they are both the same type of object that will work with HV, but with the exception that HV particles will not show the actual particle itself. So now if we add in hypervoxels, Control F6 to open up the Effects and Volumetrics tab, I'm going to add in hypervoxels. We can double click. I'm going to open up Viper so we'll be able to see a preview of these hypervoxels. I'll set this to 640 by 480, rearrange our panels just a little, and now we can double click on that emitter HV and start to see the hypervoxels showing up within our scene. I'll reduce our particle size so we can see a little bit better, and now we'll be able to use these particles to render hypervoxels effects without those particles showing up. We can go ahead and close that out, and if I go and remove that HV emitter from the scene, go back to Dynamics, add in Particle Effect with a Partigon emitter, and set up the same sort of motion that we had, 0 for resistance, 120 for the life frame, and set the explosion to 3. Of course, we are going to see these particles when we render. If we go to Hypervoxels and enable the emitter, open up Viper, we're going to see that we can also affect these particles. But if you're going to be working with a transparent surface within Hypervoxels, you're going to see these particles render within the scene, unless of course you set their particle size to 0 pixels, which you can easily do. So if you're not sure which you want to work with, whether or not you want to see the particles, you could start with just a particle emitter, and then if you don't want that to render in the scene, we can go to Edges and set a particle line thickness to 0 pixels, or we could also go to Render and do Unseen by Camera. But you never know the effects of how that is going to work with the HV and whether or not the hypervoxels will still be enabled. And so now that we've covered the differences between these two types of particle objects, let's start taking a look at modifying and actually creating some different motions with our particles, and then of course using all of our other dynamic options with our collisions and gravity and wind, because there's really a lot we can do with our particles. And also keep in mind that these gravity and wind options will also work with soft body dynamics and hard effects, which we're not going to go into because we're focusing mainly on particles, but also know that those will work directly with our particle effects, and it is kind of a global dynamic option.